It is curious to note that over the past few years, a troubling phenomenon has emerged. More than 70% of Catholics no longer believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. How did we get here? What once seemed like an unwavering conviction has gradually weakened in people's minds, as if spirituality had lost an essential pillar. Here, the Church plays a crucial role, having always preserved this truth as something sacred. Yet, as faith wanes, there is an almost silent search to understand this loss. Faith is like a flame without maintenance. It eventually dies out. Many young Christians, perhaps without realizing it, have ceased to nurture their devotion to the Eucharist, as if simply attending Mass could revive their faith. What's missing? Perhaps a deeper understanding of Christ's presence, something beyond simple explanation, something that touches the heart and transforms the soul. This transformation, over the centuries, has kept thousands of believers attached to the Church and its teachings, even in the darkest times. What would happen if everyone understood that what is present in the Eucharist is not merely a symbol, but Christ himself, just as the apostles saw him in the flesh? This recognition is essential to rediscover the very essence of faith and the spirituality that permeates the Christian tradition. The Church, through worship and praise, seeks to revive this real experience, but the response depends on each individual. What will it take for this belief to be reignited in every heart? In a world where the actions of public figures are amplified by social media, the smallest gesture takes on a significant dimension, especially when it touches on faith. A recent example is Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, whose actions in a controversial context were perceived as disrespectful toward the Eucharist. For many believers, this felt like a direct attack on the very essence of Christianity. It was not just an isolated action, it was an offense against the Church, worship, and everything it represents for millions of Christians worldwide. This kind of behavior raises a delicate question. How should public figures show respect for religion in a society that values diversity and respect? It is paradoxical to see faith treated with such disregard in certain circles. This incident with Whitmer revived the debate about the respect public figures owe to the spirituality of others, reminding us that Christianity and the Bible are pillars of the lives of many believers, and public actions against these values impact thousands. Faced with these offenses, how should the faithful react? For many, it is essential not to overlook such behavior, but to reaffirm their faith and encourage respect for religion in all spheres of life. After all, how can we build a truly tolerant society without respect for others' beliefs? This question invites deeper reflection on freedom of expression and its limits. The way the Eucharist is received has become a passionate subject of debate among the faithful. Many Catholics believe that receiving communion in the hand weakens the sense of reverence toward the sacrament, turning a deeply spiritual act into a more routine gesture. The idea is that by holding the host, one loses some of the sacred feeling that accompanies receiving Jesus Christ. This perception is particularly strong among those who see kneeling and receiving communion on the tongue as a sign of adoration and respect. Imagine this experience: kneeling, bowing your head, closing your eyes, and receiving the host directly on your tongue. This gesture goes beyond the physical and touches a more intense spiritual dimension. For some, this practice holds devotional significance, directly connecting them with the presence of Christ. Many young Christians, by performing this act of devotion, feel closer to the gospel and the essence of Christianity, understanding the value of a ritual that goes beyond the simple gesture. This discussion is not merely about protocol. It questions how each practice influences our perception of faith and the impact it has on our spiritual life. The question that remains is this: by making communion more convenient and less sacred, are we risking distancing ourselves from this essential reverence? This questioning opens a wide debate, urging each of us to reflect on the true meaning of worship and what nourishes our connection with the divine. The tradition of communion carries centuries of teaching and practices that have ingrained respect for this sacrament. From the early days of the Church, receiving the Eucharist has been seen as one of the most sublime and respectful moments of the Christian faith. Kneeling and receiving the host on the tongue are gestures that symbolize humility and total surrender to the presence of Jesus Christ. This gesture is not merely a custom, it is an expression of worship and faith, a connection with the very essence of the gospel. Imagine the impact of centuries of tradition passed down from generation to generation, shaping the way millions of Christians express their spirituality. These practices serve as visual and emotional reminders of the profound mystery surrounding the Eucharist. It is through this mystery that faith is renewed, strengthened, and preserved, connecting the faithful to the living presence of Christ. By preserving these traditions, the Church reaffirms the idea that faith is not a mere choice but a commitment. History shows that the way we receive communion shapes our spiritual experience and how each Christian connects with Christ himself. This respect for tradition is both a testimony and a teaching for young Christians, who, by observing these rituals, understand the depth of Christian spirituality. Tradition is not just the preservation of the past, but a bridge to the present, reminding us of what truly matters. The practice of receiving communion standing and in the hand has raised new questions about how posture influences our perception of the sacred. For many, this less traditional approach could reduce the solemnity of the moment, turning it into a more ordinary gesture, less spiritual. Receiving the Eucharist this way can create the impression that the act is just a routine part of worship rather than a deep encounter with Jesus Christ. This change in practice is at the heart of the discussion on the faith crisis of our time. Many young Christians, adopting this more modern practice, find themselves questioning the meaning and value of the Eucharist in their lives. Seeing this act unfold in a routine manner, they lose sight of the spiritual weight this sacrament carries. It's as if the form directly influences the religious experience, overshadowing the symbolism of adoration and self-giving. This difference is noticeable in the impact on an older generation that experienced communion as a moment of absolute reverence, compared to a generation that, in many cases, is moving away from this sense. It is interesting to think that an apparently simple change could provoke such a deep and complex reaction among the faithful. This practice of receiving communion more practically invites everyone to reflect on what they are truly seeking in their spirituality. Are we conforming too much to the comforts of modernity, or are we drifting away from something essential? This is a reflection that continues to touch hearts and minds in search of a more authentic understanding of religion. The Second Vatican Council introduced several reforms that deeply impacted the way Catholics practice their faith, including the option to receive communion in the hand. This change aimed to make the Eucharist more accessible and closer to the faithful, but it also sparked debates about maintaining respect for the sacred. For some, this flexibilization made the moment more human and welcoming, while for others, it raised concerns about the impact on traditional reverence for the presence of Christ. It is interesting to see how these changes influence the perception of rituals across different generations. The younger generation, having grown up in a post-Vatican II environment, may not have experienced the solemnity of the times when receiving communion on the tongue was the norm. For them, receiving communion in the hand is something ordinary, almost automatic, while older generations see these changes as a move away from practices that cultivated a deeper adoration and, for them, more meaningful. This contrast highlights how practice directly affects the faith experience of each generation. Vatican II sought a church more connected to modern times, but it also opened doors to discussions about balancing modernity and tradition. With communion in the hand, a question arises. How far should adaptation to new times go before transforming sacred practices? This reflection leads us to consider the value of traditions and how much faith and spirituality should conform to cultural evolution. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the practice of receiving communion in the hand gained even more weight, encouraged by public health measures. This temporary change was seen as necessary to protect the faithful, but it left a lasting mark on the way the Eucharist is experienced in many parishes. The adoption of this new habit led many to question how far the practice should adapt in exceptional circumstances without compromising the spiritual meaning of the sacrament. Many faithful felt the absence of more traditional rituals, such as receiving communion on the tongue, during this period. For them, this health-related practice, while necessary, sometimes seemed to dilute the symbolism of worship surrounding the sacrament. Young and old alike were forced to reflect on how the gesture influences what they feel and believe. Even in the face of practical necessity, spirituality and the sacred sense remain essential, especially in times of uncertainty and challenge. Even with the end of pandemic restrictions, some dioceses have maintained the practice of receiving communion in the hand, provoking mixed reactions among the faithful. While some have adapted to this change, others wish to return to the customs they consider more reverent. This unexpected period has sparked reflection on the adaptability of faith. How far are we willing to adjust our practices without losing the essence of what truly matters? Church leaders like Cardinal Canizares have issued a fervent call for a return to receiving communion on the tongue as a way to restore reverence for the sacrament. They believe that the act of receiving the Eucharist on the tongue while kneeling symbolizes deep respect for the real presence of Christ. This position argues that the act itself silently communicates the sacred and eternal value of the sacrament, reminding the faithful of its central importance in the Christian life. For these leaders, the gesture, it is not just a tradition, but an expression of spirituality itself. Receiving communion on the tongue, according to some, strengthens the intimate connection between the Christian and Jesus Christ, making the moment even more significant. The way we receive the Eucharist can, in this way, strengthen the faith of young Christians and revive the devotion of older ones, creating a tangible link to the sacred that transcends routine. This is a call to return to what is considered essential for the strengthening of spirituality. This call to return to receiving communion on the tongue resonates with those who feel that some gestures have been lost over time. After all, acts of adoration are not mere details but visible expressions of faith. At its core, the question remains, what can we still recover to bring the spiritual essence back into our religious practices? The Church plays a fundamental role in preserving this sense of reverence towards the practice of the Eucharist, especially in an era marked by frequent liturgical changes. It is crucial that the faithful not only participate in a ritual but understand the deep mystery it embodies. For Catholics, the Eucharist is the real presence of Christ, and the Church must be its guardian. This involves the necessity of continuously reminding and teaching the faithful about the importance of this sacrament, while ensuring that reverence is not diluted by practices that may seem trivial. Liturgical practice, though essentially spiritual, also reflects in the attitudes and gestures of the people of God. The Church, as the spiritual guide of the community, must ensure that practices such as the way to receive the Eucharist continue to promote respect and the holiness of this moment, starting with catechesis through teachings that go beyond just attending Mass. Participating consciously and respectfully in the Eucharist is a way to strengthen both personal and collective faith, showing others the impact of an act filled with love and devotion. Preserving reverence for the Eucharist also means ensuring that the true essence of this sacrament is not lost in the distractions of modernity. In a society where speed and superficiality dominate, the Church must remain an anchor, leading the faithful to a deep and transformative encounter with Christ through the Eucharist. The preservation of this sacredness is in the hands of each of us. The vision of young Catholics regarding the Eucharist has been influenced by a constantly changing world, where cultural, social, and even technological influences directly impact how they live their faith. Many of these young people, although filled with great devotion, struggle to find a deeper meaning in a religious practice that aligns with their daily lives. The Eucharist, central to Catholic tradition, may seem, to some, like a distant tradition, a rite lost in the demands of a hurried world. However, a growing movement among young Christians seeks to restore understanding and respect for the Eucharist. This group, aware of the importance of the sacrament, aspires for the Church to clarify what it really means to receive communion. For them, the Eucharist is not just a symbolic gesture. It is a unique way to connect with Christ, strengthen their faith, and find a higher purpose. But for this to happen, there needs to be an environment that educates them in a deeper and more engaging way about the significance of the Eucharist. In this context, testimonies of faith become essential. Young people who share their personal experiences with the sacrament have the power to inspire others to rediscover their faith. This can be done through Bible studies, prayer groups, or even informal gatherings to discuss how the Eucharist is experienced today. After all, young people need to feel that the Church and its rites are not relics of the past, but a living force that guides them on their spiritual journey. The practice of receiving the Eucharist, whether in the hand or on the tongue, varies significantly between cultures and regions, reflecting different liturgical traditions and interpretations of the sacrament's sacredness. In some parts of the world, communion on the tongue is seen as a symbol of greater respect and reverence, preserving the ancient tradition of the Church. Meanwhile, in other regions, receiving the Eucharist in the hand has become the norm, especially where the emphasis is on the active participation of the faithful during Massachusetts. These cultural differences not only illustrate the diversity within the Catholic Church, but they also invite us to reflect on what these practices mean for the faith of individuals. For example, in some European countries, the tradition of communion on the tongue is considered almost sacred, a rite that strengthens the personal relationship with Christ. However, in some parts of Latin America, where communities are more informal, communion in the hand is more common and may be seen as a way to make the rite more accessible and less distant. The impact of these variations on the perception of the Eucharist also raises the question of how different cultures understand and live the mystery of faith. Regardless of how it is received, communion should always be a moment of intimate encounter with Christ, but the different ways of receiving it can influence the depth of that encounter. This cultural diversity is a precious opportunity to reflect on the universality of Christianity and how it adapts and lives in unique ways around the world. In every place, religious education plays a crucial role in shaping the beliefs of the faithful about the Eucharist, particularly among the young. The way the Church teaches about the sacrament is not limited to theoretical learning, but also includes practical experience. By offering young people a deep understanding of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the Church prepares them for a more meaningful encounter with the sacrament. It's not just about knowing what it is, but understanding how to live this truth every day. Catechism programs and Bible studies have the power to transform young people's understanding of the Eucharist by encouraging them to see the sacrament as much more than a simple liturgical act. These programs need to be dynamic, current, and connected to the realities that young people face. By including testimonies of faith and examples from daily life, it is possible to make the Eucharist a central pillar in the lives of young people, helping them understand that they are not just participating in a tradition, but receiving divine grace. Furthermore, the effectiveness of these programs relies on an approach that goes beyond words and is translated into concrete action. Young people need to see the example of a church that lives what it teaches, a church that, through its daily practices, demonstrates respect for the Eucharist. In this way, religious education becomes a powerful tool for strengthening faith and preserving reverence for the real presence of Christ, allowing young people to understand and experience the Eucharist in a transformative way.